All right, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight at the Traverse Area District Library. You can find all of our events at TADL.org/events. And then a lot of our Zoom programs are also recorded, and you can find them on our YouTube channel, TADL Not Just Books. This one will be as well. If you have to, for anyone who wants to join in later or watch it again to find out some interesting facts about Amanda Barratt, who is our author tonight. Thank you so much for coming. She is an award-winning author with her latest book being Warsaw Sisters that I just finished and I highly recommend. And she's going to talk about her process and the true stories that inspired her to write this book. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here. I'm so looking forward to sharing a bit about the process of researching and writing the Warsaw Sisters and the process of researching and writing historical fiction. And at the end, I'm very happy to take questions, answer anything about research, writing, history. So you can certainly save your questions and I'll be happy to take those.
Perfect.
So in exploring the multifaceted narrative of history, the stories I am most drawn to are those I call the courage of the commonplace. Ordinary people who, when thrust into times that test the very substance of humanity, fight with quiet resilience to uphold and preserve that which should be most sacred to society, freedom, human dignity, and human life itself. Their stories are profoundly compelling, but as is so often the case, been lost in the shadows of history. So today, for these few moments we have together, I'm going to introduce you to a few of them. So won't you journey with me to Warsaw, a city that survived its own death? On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's troops invaded Poland. This act would catapult not only Germany and Poland, but in time, a great portion of the world into what we now call the Second World War. The surrender of Warsaw, Poland's capital, 28 days later, marked the start of more than 5 years of occupation, brutality, and unrelenting terror for the people of Warsaw. This vibrant city of over 1 million inhabitants fell under the administration of what was called the General Government, a part of Poland under German occupation but not incorporated into the German Reich. Street raids, arrests, and deportations to forced labor in Germany and concentration camps became a fact of daily life for all Polish citizens. One historian wrote that nowhere in all of Nazi-occupied Europe was the extensive machinery of repression as great as it was in Poland. More than 5 million Polish citizens perished during the Second World War, approximately 3 million Jews among them. In the autumn of 1940, the occupation authorities ordered the establishment of what they call the Jewish district in the city of Warsaw. It would become the largest ghetto in occupied Poland. In time, 460,000 people would reside within the ghetto, an area of 1.3 square miles surrounded by a 10-foot-high brick wall crowned with barbed wire and bits of broken glass to prevent anyone from trying to escape by scaling it. The ghetto had been established in an area of the city where many of the buildings were run down and lacked modern amenities. In many flats, 6 to 7 people shared one room. Think about that for a minute. Imagine sharing a room with 6 other people, some of them strangers, not just for a day or two, but for week after week. Imagine passing the body of someone who died on the street covered with only a scrap of newspaper. Imagine walking down the street and passing children on the sidewalks begging for bread, and you have to turn away from their cries because you don't even have enough to feed your own family. Imagine a deadly epidemic, typhus spreading rapidly, and the fear of your own family becoming infected. And again, because it's so crowded, how do you protect your family? How do you keep your clothes free from lice? These were the realities faced by the ghetto's inhabitants. Between 1940 and mid-1942, 83,000 people died, mainly from disease and starvation. But the worst was yet to come. In July 1942, the occupation authorities ordered the deportation of the ghetto's population. Each day, a human quota of between 6,000 to 7,000 men, women, and children had to be met. They were rounded up and loaded into rail cars. The official announcement stated that these people were being sent to do labor in the East. The German authorities even offered an incentive. Anyone who volunteers for resettlement will receive 3 kilos of bread and 1 kilo of marmalade. With starvation widespread, many people reported voluntarily for deportation. They did indeed receive their 3 kilos of bread, and they were crowded into the rail cars. The majority of the trains arrived at a station near a village called Treblinka, approximately 50 miles northeast of Warsaw. Nearby was one of the 3 camps established as part of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to eliminate the Jewish population. At this camp, which was almost completely camouflaged by the surrounding forest, from July 22nd to late September, 265,000 to 300,000 Jewish men, women, and children from the Warsaw Ghetto were gassed with carbon monoxide in specially prepared chambers. These figures might seem intangible until you think that it isn't just a number. It's 265,000 human lives. It's 265,000 murders. But in the midst of all this, there was light, candle flames of hope. One of these lights was a network organized and operated primarily by women. One of them was a Warsaw social worker in her early 30s named Irena Sendler. Due to her position at the Warsaw Welfare Department, Irena and a few colleagues managed to obtain passes, authorizing them to enter the ghetto on matters of sanitation and epidemic control. Irena had Jewish friends, and contrary to the anti-Semitism, which was regrettably widespread in Poland at the time, she was determined not to ignore what was happening. At first, in the early days of the ghetto, these women secretly brought food, medicine, and typhus vaccines into the walled district. But as time passed, they embarked on an even more dangerous undertaking, smuggling children out. Keep in mind that at this time in Poland, the occupation authorities had clearly stated the penalty not only for a Jewish person caught outside the ghetto, but a non-Jew who provided them aid or shelter, execution. This was far more extreme than the measures implemented in other countries in occupied Europe, such as France and the Netherlands, when the penalty would be imprisonment in a concentration camp. But Irena and her friends remained dauntless. Their efforts grew in urgency as the deportations to Treblinka began, and news about the true fate of those on the transports began to trickle out. Irena and her colleagues used a variety of methods to smuggle children out. Through the law courts, which could be accessed from both the ghetto and the outside world, through cellars in buildings bordering the ghetto, in ambulances and trams, in crates and sacks, in work brigades leaving the ghetto, and even through the sewer canals. Irena later recounted how fearful parents pressed her for assurances about their child's safety. "I spoke frankly," she said. "I said I couldn't even be certain I would safely leave the ghetto with a child that very day." Scenes from hell ensued. For instance, the father would agree to give us the child, but the mother would refuse. Sometimes I would leave such a family with their child. The next day, I would return to see what happened to the family, and frequently it would turn out that the entire family was already in the Umschlagplatz, which was the collection point for the deportations. Imagine being a mother in that situation. News about the fate of those in the transports had begun to trickle out, but for many, the reality of mass murder was unfathomable. The heart-wrenching choice between separation from your child or remaining together to face whatever unknown awaited. How to make such a choice, how to trust your child's life to a stranger. Yet so many mothers did. Irena always said later that they were the true heroines. Once a child had been brought outside the ghetto, they would be taken to what was called an emergency care unit. These were homes throughout the city and the surrounding area where a child would be cared for in their first days outside the ghetto. They would be given food and a bath, their clothes would be cleaned or new ones would be provided, and they would be taught Catholic prayers and other necessities of survival. For in crossing across the wall, these children had become the hunted. Those who rescued these children are remembered as heroes, but their heroism wasn't established in a single act. It was day after day of choices, actions, risks, and sacrifices. I think when we ask ourselves, what would I have done in that situation, that's something we need to remember. It wasn't just one choice, it was countless choices. Some small, others great. And in those choices, in that faithfulness, that really is the true substance of heroism. After a stay in one of the emergency care units, the children will be provided with false documents and placed in orphanages, religious institutions, or foster families. In late 1942, Irena made contact with a newly founded organization, the Council for Aid to Jews, known by its cryptonym Jagoda. Irena became head of the section dedicated to providing aid to children. Her work continued until late October 1943, when the Gestapo arrived at her flat early one morning. There had been an arrest of a woman who used her laundry shop as an underground contact point. Interrogated and tortured, the woman betrayed Irena's name. As the Gestapo stormed up the stairs to her flat, Irena managed to quickly give the small rolls of tissue paper on which she had written information about the children helped by the network to a friend and fellow member of the network who had been visiting at the time, and the woman was able to conceal them under her dress. Irena was taken to the infamous detention center on Sucha Avenue. The Gestapo didn't suspect Irena, a blonde woman in her early 30s who was barely 5 feet tall, could possibly be a leader in the underground. A bit player maybe, who, put under enough pressure, could reveal information about her superiors. During the weeks of her imprisonment, the Gestapo tortured her brutally. Both Irena's legs were broken, and for the rest of her life, she suffered from pain as a result. But Irena resolutely betrayed no one. Because she alone knew where all the children had been placed, her colleagues in Jagoda set out to rescue her and succeeded in bribing a Gestapo officer for her release. One day, Irena's name was called out among those sentenced for execution, but at the last moment, she was led away and went free. Now Irena was the one to assume a false identity. When her mother passed away, Irena couldn't even attend the funeral for fear the Gestapo might be watching. The exact number of children helped by Irena and her colleagues remains unknown. According to testimony compiled by Irena and 3 of her closest associates in 1979, the Children's Department of Jagoda aided as many as 2,500 children. Whatever the number, each small life left a legacy outlasting the darkness. Before the war, Poland was home to nearly 1 million Jewish children under the age of 14. Of those children who remained in Poland during the war, only an estimated 5,000 survived, and most had lost one or both parents. In 1965, Yad Vashem recognized Irena Sendler as righteous among the nations, but the Soviet regime in Poland refused to authorize Irena's passport, so she couldn't even travel to Jerusalem to accept the award. Though the name of Irena Sendler has become renowned, and deservedly so, she was only one member of a courageous fraternity. She later said, "I could not have achieved anything were it not for that group of women I trusted who were with me in the ghetto every day and who transformed their homes into care centers for children. These were exceptionally brave and noble people. As for me, it was simple. I remembered what my father had taught me. When someone is drowning, you give him your hand. I simply tried to extend my hand to the Jewish people." Despite the swift consequences for resistance, a thriving underground sprang up in Poland in the immediate aftermath of occupation. By 1940, 140 separate underground groups had been formed in Warsaw alone. The history of the unification of the Polish resistance is complex, but on February 14, 1942, the organization officially became known as the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. The Home Army wasn't merely a resistance group, but the armed forces of the Polish underground state, subordinate to the government in exile in London. By 1944, it had become one of the largest resistance movements in occupied Europe, with over 350,000 soldiers throughout Poland. During the years of occupation, the Home Army carried out all manner of resistance, from the so-called small sabotage operations, such as distributing leaflets and painting the anchor symbol of the Polish underground on walls, to blowing up trains supplying the Eastern Front, to carrying out executions of members of the Gestapo and SS. Young women were key figures in the Home Army, as they could easily walk through the streets of Warsaw carrying underground newspapers in their handbags or ammunition in their market baskets, innocuous girls who became steely foot soldiers. The Home Army also amassed weapons and trained their members in preparation for future battle. The idea of a larger coordinated insurrection had been brewing for some time, but it was not known where it would take place or whether Warsaw would even be involved. Flash forward to the summer of 1944. Germany's defeat seemed not only possible, but inevitable. The advancing Red Army forced German troops to retreat, and German civil authorities evacuated Warsaw in droves as the Soviets surged across Poland in a massive offensive operation. The Allied invasion of Normandy began in June, and the attempt on Hitler's life on the 20th of July gave further evidence of the collapse of the Reich. With the Soviets approaching Warsaw and the Germans fleeing, this seemed an opportune time for the Home Army to take action. Not only would the uprising be a battle against the hated occupiers, but a political move against the Soviets and a threat of communist rule, which would simply mean trading one occupation for another. The Polish people would be reclaiming their city, Poles liberating instead of being liberated. On the evening of July 31st, the leadership of the Home Army issued the order for the uprising to begin at 5 p.m. the following day. On August 1st, thousands of men and women filled the streets of Warsaw, hurrying to their posts in silent accord. They wore overcoats to conceal weapons and carried rucksacks and parcels filled with ammunition and supplies. At various points throughout the city they assembled, donning white and red armbands that had been stitched and stamped by the female members of the Home Army. On the first day of the battle, only 10% of insurgents had guns. Many were armed with only a single hand grenade, most manufactured by the Home Army in clandestine factories. In the first days of the uprising, an atmosphere of freedom and exhilaration prevailed as the Home Army captured large swaths of the city. However, they failed to gain control of key bridges, railway stations, airports, and main military and police installations. The Home Army began the uprising with the expectation that the Soviet army would reach the city in a few days and provide military support. But the Soviets did not arrive, and very soon the tide began to shift. In response to the Polish insurrection, Hitler and Himmler issued the order: every citizen of Warsaw is to be killed, including men, women, and children. Warsaw has to be leveled to the ground in order to set a terrifying example to the rest of Europe. German reinforcements mounted a counterattack, and as they overtook the districts Wola and Ochota, they ruthlessly murdered civilians. The Wola massacre would become the largest single battlefield massacre of the Second World War. Over the course of only a week, an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 civilians in Wola alone were rounded up and slaughtered by SS and police units. One of the most devastating testimonies of the massacre in Wola came from a woman named Wanda Lurie. Wanda was rounded up and taken to a factory complex in Wola, where the executions were being carried out. She was heavily pregnant, and with her were her 3 children, aged 11, 6, and 3.5 years of age. Waiting outside the factory gate in a mass of people, listening to shots coming from within, surrounded by guards, Wanda tried to keep to the back of the line for as long as she could, hoping something would happen, somehow rescue would come. But in the end, she and her 3 children were forced through the gates into the factory grounds, where they saw heaps of corpses, hundreds and hundreds of bodies. Wanda pleaded with a guard to save her and her children, offering him some jewelry as a bribe. The guard seemed ready to accept Wanda's offer, but the officer in charge intervened, shoving them back into the group awaiting execution. Wanda's 3 children were shot in front of her and fell among the bodies. Wanda too was shot, but she survived. Wounded, she lay among the growing pile of corpses as more people were brought to the factory as the killing went on. For 3 days, Wanda remained there, lying beside the bodies of her children. Only when she felt her unborn child kicking for life inside her did Wanda gather the strength to rise, and somehow she managed to escape the factory. As August passed, German artillery and bombers besieged Warsaw's Old Town. Their bombing mission started early in the morning and continued every half hour until evening, decimating buildings and leading to immense loss of civilian life. These civilians, mothers with young children, the elderly, found themselves on the front lines of an increasingly desperate battle. They took refuge in cellars where they remained for weeks, running out of food, water increasingly scarce, trapped, and waiting for whatever end would come. Throughout the course of the uprising, 40 to 50,000 people took part in the Home Army, and with them were around 12,000 women. They served as couriers, nurses, and combatants, suffering and sacrificing as soldiers. Exploring their stories was a profoundly moving experience. I think of Christina, only a teenager when the uprising broke out. She became a medic and stretcher bearer, scrambling over rubble to collect the wounded and carry them to first aid posts, one of the many teenage girls functioning as makeshift ambulances. She had only basic medical training, and the Home Army had limited access to medical supplies. "You get used to seeing blood," she later said, "but you don't get used to suffering." Other women would serve as couriers. Often they were the only link between units because the Home Army didn't have field telephones. They delivered messages under fire, at risk of bombs, artillery, and snipers. To make sure a message would get through, often a commander would send 2 couriers with the same message, for if one was killed, the other would hopefully still be able to deliver the necessary information. Many who served in the Home Army were in their teens and early 20s. They were young and idealistic. As one woman who served as a courier later recalled, "We were ready to give everything, absolutely everything, for freedom." In the heightened atmosphere of battle, romances blossomed and bonds deepened. A ravaged city may seem an improbable place for a wedding, but more than 250 marriages took place during the uprising. These ceremonies were rushed, unions officiated by priests who spent the majority of the fighting, offering comfort to the dying and holding services for the fallen. In these desperate times, the young Home Army soldiers clung to any semblance of normalcy. A groom would pick flowers from an overgrown balcony, brides would borrow a clean blouse from a friend, couples would exchange curtain rings in place of wedding bands. One evening, a young Home Army soldier who went by the pseudonym of Hawk and his sweetheart Helena decided to marry. During a reprieve in the artillery fire, they made their way to a cathedral. One of the witnesses at their wedding had to be carried in on the back of one of his friends as he'd been hit in the legs on his way to the church. Hawk and Helena pledged themselves to one another before a priest. After a brief celebration, everyone returned to their positions. Within moments, the artillery barrage resumed. Both Hawk and Helena were killed. In their death, as in their love, they were united. District after district fell as the weeks passed. Home Army soldiers fought fiercely and suffered heavy casualties. The battalion in my novel suffered a casualty rate of 70%. Nearly all of the soldiers in that battalion were in their teens and early 20s. Among the fallen were some of Poland's finest youth, poets, musicians, artists. As one man said, "We are part of a nation whose fate it is to shoot at the enemy with diamonds." Finally, with the city a wasteland, the Home Army desperately short of ammunition and weapons, the civilians starving, the Home Army surrendered on October 2nd, 1944, having fought for 63 days. As many as 180,000 civilians and 18,000 Home Army soldiers had perished. After the surrender of the Home Army, the Germans expelled nearly the entire population of Warsaw. They were processed through a transit camp and deported to forced labor in Germany or simply sent to other parts of Poland. Others were sent to concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Home Army soldiers became POWs. Following the suppression of the uprising, Hitler reiterated the order that the city be razed to the ground, an act of revenge which had no military grounds whatsoever. After the city was looted, crews with flamethrowers and dynamite annihilated what remained. The destruction of Warsaw, both during and the aftermath of the uprising, amounted to over 80% of all buildings. On the 17th of January 1945, the Soviets entered Warsaw, but the post-war years proved Poland and her citizens had not regained their independence. Under the Stalinist regime, veterans of the Home Army were hunted and persecuted. Thousands were imprisoned or deported to labor camps. Many were executed. One former courier had a 1-year-old son at the time of her arrest. Her imprisonment lasted more than 5 years. The repression of former insurgents eased in the mid-1950s, but only with the fall of communism in 1989 could the restoration of memory and identity begin. But from her ruins, Warsaw emerged reborn. The meticulous reconstruction of much of the old town took place in the decades after the war. Centuries of architecture resurrected from the rubble. Today, Warsaw is once more a vibrant capital city of over 1 million inhabitants, but the scars of war remain embedded into her landscape. And still, every year at 5 o'clock on August 1st, sirens resound across Warsaw and in towns and cities all over Poland. For 60 seconds, traffic stops and pedestrians still. Even as the sirens swell, a hush descends over the city that rose for freedom and rose again from the ashes. Bringing these stories to the page was a process of exploration and discovery, a journey that led me from stacks upon stacks of books as I sought to gain a perspective not only of the historical panorama, but also the deeply personal experiences of individuals, to a museum that housed a collection of archives related to the Polish resistance. I held a cap and a helmet worn by Home Army soldiers during the uprising. I stood in front of a case holding copies of the underground newspaper published by the resistance, the same newspaper that young courier girls used to smuggle in their satchels to distribute words of freedom. It was a very personal journey for me because my great-grandparents immigrated from Poland, and Polish cultures and traditions formed a part of my childhood. Story is a very powerful vehicle for remembrance. And as more and more Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans pass each year, remembrance and the preservation of history becomes even more imperative. I wrote the Warsaw Sisters as a tribute to what I call the sparks of light in the night of war, the ordinary who quietly resisted. Their legacy is one of courage birthed by adversity, an extraordinary sacrifice. They did not seek to become heroes, yet the imprint of their heroism endures. So that's what I have for you, and I would now love to take any questions. If anyone has any questions about the research, writing the Warsaw Sisters, the history I've discussed, anything at all, I'm happy to take those.
Thank you so much. That was going to be my question is, how did you do this research? Obviously, uh, my assumption is that you definitely read a lot of diaries, and first accounts for the most part, second account, all everything. And where would you even begin? I mean, how did you even begin? Obviously, your grandparents, you grew up with some stories, and so that piqued your interest and then went from there. But I have a hard time. It's such a beautiful story. It really was. Your novel was well written. It's so heartbreaking. How do you keep going and want to write more? Because I know that you love this era.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored you enjoyed it. That means so much. For me, the research very much grew out of the research for my previous novel, Within These Walls of Sorrow, which was set in Krakow, Poland, in the Krakow ghetto. And so while researching that novel, I discovered many of the stories that came to become the Warsaw Sisters. And for this novel, I was really able to build on that foundation that I'd already really gained learning about Poland during the occupation. I read over 100 books to write this novel. I always seek out not those personal stories, those human stories, because those are often what really make it into the novel and really form the skeleton of authenticity and also the human story. And so I explored those, and those were very moving. I was able to access a lot of interviews with veterans of the Home Army that have been made available by the Warsaw Uprising Museum, and listening and reading the accounts of the young women who, were much older when they were being interviewed, but, they were recollecting what they experienced as young women, listening to those who were Jewish survivors and who had lived in the Warsaw Ghetto and who had been, suffered under the Jewish Holocaust in Poland. Again, very moving, and many of those also did become part of the novel and really influenced that. For me, it's something that continues all throughout as I continue to read as much as possible. I'm always reading more firsthand accounts, more books. I always really try to seek to immerse myself in the history as much as possible. Watching footage, there's a lot of footage of Warsaw during the war that was film footage of the Warsaw Ghetto. A German film crew actually went into the Warsaw Ghetto and filmed footage, so I was able to access that, and that really gave a picture of what the ghetto would have been like in those horrific conditions. And so yes, and I think for me, this novel, really my favorite, was being able to visit that museum. Since I wrote the novel during the years of the pandemic, I wasn't able to travel over to Poland specifically, but being able to access that museum, which was a couple of hours from where I live, and see those artifacts and documents was so moving. It made the history of this really tangible. I think it's really easy to relegate history into these black and white photos or these facts and dates, but it was a real vibrant thing lived by real individuals, and seeing those tangible pieces of history for me is so inspiring.
What do you do to escape from? I mean, what do you like to read? What to escape from what you're researching? And I'm sure it can be kind of a lot of pressure after a little bit. Um, is there anything? I mean, do you read the same? Who are your favorite authors? Do you like the same sort of thing, or do you like completely opposite? What do you like to veg out to?
I love historical fiction, so I do enjoy reading novels set during World War II. I have some favorite authors. I also love historical fiction set in a variety of other time periods. I have a lot of favorite authors. I love Kristen Hanna. I love Patty Callahan. I love the novels of Pam Janoff, who does write World War II. I just have so many favorites, and I love reading historical fiction. That's kind of my go-to in the midst of reading, the nonfiction that I read for research. So I also really love escaping into, comfort food TV shows. So something like All Creatures Great and Small, or I Love Lucy. Just something if the research becomes too heavy, I do find that for my own mental health, so I do have to take a step back from time to time and just, focus on something else. Enjoy spending time with my family, spending time in nature, and that really helps to balance the heaviness of that. But for me, when the heaviness it does become great, I really always return to the fact that these stories need to be told, and my passion is to tell them, and my passion is to remember those who are ordinary people and who had lived and endured during this time and who risked and sacrificed so much. And it's just, for me, it's so special to be able to honor them through novels like the Warsaw Sisters. And so that's what I always really return to when the research becomes overwhelming.
That makes sense. If the people who are still on Zoom, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask questions or write it in chat. We can go that way as well if you'd like. I am a completely, like I just mentioned, a completely frivolous reader. So for me to read something on this topic, it's a big step for me, but I absolutely love audiobooks, and that's how I get through heavy books. Because you can't really flip to the end and find out what happens or go back and forth. I just read it or listen to it straight out. And I love the person who read, I think there's two actually, right? That read your audiobook or narrated it. It was fantastic. And so then at the same time, I figured, oh, why not? I'll just go on to the next one. And I just listened to Kristen Hanna's new book, to The Women, as well, and a different time period, but still pretty heavy war. And so I like that you said Kristen Hanna as well. She's one of my favorites too.
She's fantastic. I have a new copy of her new book and very much looking forward to read it. I've loved all of her. I love her historical fiction especially.
Yeah, absolutely. Nightingale was phenomenal. And but yeah, this one I thought was going to be a little too much because Four Winds was a little too much for me, but it's not. It's perfect. And it was a good balance between hers and yours. I didn't have to go to, a paperback romance in between. I was good. Um, Gosh, I had a million questions, and then actually in your presentation you answered a lot of them. So you were well prepared. Thank you very much. What do you have sitting on I see your bookshelf behind you. Are those your books, or are those books like to be read?
So I have multiple bookshelves. My house is a house filled with bookshelves. So the bookshelf behind me is actually all my research books, World War II research books. So those are all. And then out in another room, I have my shelves of fiction and nonfiction about other time periods, my classic literature. So that's on it. But what is behind me is my research books. I'm sitting at my desk right now, where I do all of my writing. So I love having my research books close at hand, so I can, because I'm ceaselessly referencing them. My desk is a cluttered mess when I'm writing in the midst of a first draft of research books and notes, and my calendar, my World War II calendar that I print out for every book that I do, that goes year by year, so I can mark dates that are going to be pivotal to the story and kind of chart the timeline of the novel. So yes. Love my research books.
Have you put stories from your grandparents in their stories in any of your books at all?
I would love to know more about my grandparents. They were actually living in the United States at the time of World War II, so I'm certain that they had relatives over there. They've passed away, sadly, when I was young, so I wasn't able to learn too much about all of that. But yes, would love to know more about my family's history. Recently, I reunited with a family member, and they actually gave me a lot, some of my great grandfather's immigration papers that he had. They had some photocopies of those. So I'm really, at some point, I want to translate those because they're in Polish, and so I want to translate those and learn more, because family history is so fascinating. There are so many stories to be uncovered.
Absolutely. Are you working on another book right now? I'm going to assume yes.
Yes, I'm researching my next novel, which is also going to take place during World War II. I can't say too much about it yet. I don't have an official title or anything, but it's inspired by another little known story of courage and resistance and women. I love focusing on women's stories in war. I really love that now seem to be in this era in novels and historical fiction where women's stories are really being explored and celebrated, and that's something that I'm very passionate about doing in my own novels. So yes.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions at all for Miss Amanda? Sorry. I'll give them just a second because sometimes it's hard to type. Have you when did you write your first novel? I guess I didn't look that up. Did you start early on, like high school or college, or?
So I have been writing ever since I've loved writing ever since I was in elementary school. I just would do it. I kept lots of journals and things like that. So writing in history has always been something that I've really loved. My very first published story was actually in a historical romance anthology, and it was called The Most Eligible Bachelor Romance Collection. So a little bit different than the depths of World War II, but it was set in Gilded Age America. And I wrote several of those that were part of different anthologies. I've explored everything from the California Gold Rush to Regency England to 1800s Texas. So writing those really gave me the opportunity to explore a lot of eras and time periods. And though I've really been fascinated with World War II ever since childhood, when I read the Diary of Anne Frank and was deeply moved and inspired by that story, I never really considered writing World War II novels until I came across the story of a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which some people may have heard of. He was a German pastor and theologian, and he was also involved in the resistance movement, the German resistance movement. And at the time that he was involved in all of that, he was engaged to a young woman named Maria von Wedemeyer. And when I discovered that Bonhoeffer's story, that I knew of and I'd heard of, had this woman in his life, I immediately wanted to know, why don't we know about her? Where, her stories seem to me very much lost in the shadows, as is so often the case of those women who are part of the lives of great men. Their stories are often passed over and overlooked. So when I came across Maria's story, I began researching her life, and I discovered this absolutely remarkable woman in her own right. And so their story, I told in my novel, My Dearest Dietrich, and that was my first World War II novel. And ever since then, I've just continued to come across so many stories. Researching for me is very much like unwrapping layers of tissue paper. Each layer, it seems like, will lead to fresh discovery. And the more I delve into history, the more stories I discover that I want to share. So planning on hopefully writing lots of World War II novels to come. There are so many stories that I really hope to tell.
Fantastic. So one of the comments is to thank you, and she looks forward to reading The White Rose also.
Wonderful. Yes, that was another novel that came after My Dearest Dietrich, came out of the research for My Dearest Dietrich, the story of Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were German college students, and printed and distributed leaflets calling on the German people to rise up. And my story focuses on Sophie, who was only 21 at the time, and was eventually imprisoned and sadly executed for her role in that involvement. But it's another really a remarkable story of young people who dared to rise up, who dared to defy the status quo of Nazi Germany and to resist. And I loved being able to research and to delve into their very remarkable lives.
That one sounds interesting too. Well, thank you very much, Amanda, for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. We absolutely love when authors come and talk to public libraries, especially on Zoom, so we can keep coming back and recommending authors to patrons all the time. So I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. It's been so wonderful to spend time with you all tonight. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. I am going to try to stop this, which I'm not doing very good at it. So it is not letting me stop record. So I guess I'll just end it, and thank you so much. And we will we'll keep an eye out on your newest book. Is it going to be in the next year or so?
In the next couple of years, yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. It was so wonderful to meet you.
You too. Bye-bye.